Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question is, can I analyze the case of Lee Radder? Just a reminder, I'm not diagnosing anybody in this video, only speculating about what could be happening in a situation like this. If you enjoy this video, please like it, subscribe to my channel, and consider supporting me on Patreon. I will put the link to Patreon in the description for this video. First, I'll look at the background in this case. I'll move to the timeline of the incident, then offer my analysis. In late 2010, Norman Lee Radder was a resident of Queen Creek, Arizona, which is about 35 miles east of downtown Phoenix. He went by the name Lee. He lived in a house with his wife Belinda and their 3 children. Lee had owned a string of businesses, some of which were successful and others not as much. He had seen highs and lows, times when money was plentiful and times when he was in debt. He even went bankrupt on one occasion. At this time in the narrative, Lee was at one of those low points. He owed $25,000 to a former employer and $15,000 to the IRS. Lee was lying about an upcoming business deal. He had introduced 2 businesses to one another and told people he was going to get rich in the process, but Lee already knew this wasn't going to happen. Lee and his wife had a good relationship. She stayed with him through the ups and downs, although she wished he would have found a traditional job. Belinda's mother had died some time before, and she stayed in contact with her stepfather, Rob Fisher. Rob used to be a police officer, but he was injured. He pursued a career as an attorney. He worked in San Clemente, California. Rob Fisher drove to the Radder residence on December 29, 2010, to visit his stepdaughter, Belinda, as well as Lee and their children. This was part of the Christmas holiday. Rob was familiar with Lee. The 2 men had known each other for some time and maintained a good relationship. Rob arrived at the residence just past noon. In his possession was a semi-automatic pistol, a Sig Sauer P230. He had a license to carry it. The family went to dinner at 7 p.m. and returned to the house. Before moving to the timeline of the incident, let's hear a word from today's sponsor, Skillshare. Skillshare can help you make 2022 a year of new learning, growth, and connection through creativity. Skillshare is an online learning community with thousands of inspiring and creative classes for anyone who loves to learn. If you have a specific skill you're trying to learn and want to invest in your personal growth, Skillshare is the perfect place to start. I looked at a class on photography by Justin Bridges titled Fundamentals of DSLR Photography. He offered an excellent description of how to take fantastic photographs, including how to manage exposure through ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. The first 1,000 of my viewers to sign up using my code or link in the description will get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare, so you can start exploring your creativity today. Now moving to the timeline of the incident. Rob, Belinda, and Lee started drinking alcohol. Belinda's children went to bed at about 10:30 p.m. Around this time, Lee received an email about the business opportunity. He walked into another room and talked on the phone. It's not clear what was in the email, but it was bad news about the business. The deal wasn't going to happen. Again, Lee already knew that this was not going to make him rich. A business associate of Lee would later suggest that Lee was initially upset, but seemed to calm down. Lee returned to the kitchen and continued drinking. He consumed a significant quantity of alcohol, including vodka. Robert was drinking. Belinda was as well. She would later say she had quite a bit of wine. Belinda went to bed at around 11:30 p.m. At around 5 a.m., Rob Fisher called 911. He indicated that a man was shot. Rob said he didn't know who it was. It might have been his wife's cousin or his daughter-in-law's cousin. The call disconnected. Rob called 911 again. He continued to maintain that he didn't know who the man was. The police responded. They found Lee Radder dead on the kitchen floor. Rob was kneeling next to Lee's head. Lee had been shot once in the right eye. Rob Fisher's pistol was in Lee's right hand, and Lee's thumb was on the trigger. Rob told the police that he was a retired police officer. He asked the police if the dead man was Lee. The police asked Rob not to wash his hands, but Rob did anyway. Apparently, the police were not skilled in the area of stopping someone from doing something. I guess they just watched in amazement as Rob washed his hands. Officers also had concerns about Belinda. They felt as though she had an inappropriate emotional reaction. For example, she did not look at her husband Lee. In her initial interview with the police, Belinda said, based on when her children went to bed, the shooting must have occurred between 10:30 p.m. and 5 a.m. The police were surprised that she was unable to narrow down the time frame a little bit more. She denied being involved with her husband's death. Later, she was able to offer a timeline that satisfied the police and was eliminated as a suspect. Rob Fisher was interviewed by the police. He said that he was asleep in the guest bedroom when he was awakened by a popping sound. He claimed he didn't remember a lot of what happened. Rob went back to California and hired an attorney. Belinda hired an attorney sometime later. The autopsy report for Lee indicated his death was a homicide. The police suspected Rob was the killer based on a few different pieces of evidence. For example, he said he was asleep when the gunshot occurred, but the bed in the guest bedroom did not look like anyone had slept in it. Rob had blood spatter on his pajamas. Rob's footprints were in the blood in the kitchen. His gun was used in the killing, and there were 2 glasses of alcohol in the kitchen, one on the counter and one on the kitchen table. There was ice in both glasses. Rob was arrested and charged with second-degree murder. He was released on $500,000 bond. On November 6, 2013, his trial started. The state's theory of the crime was that Rob shot and killed Lee. Rob was clearly in the kitchen when the gun discharged, and they believed Rob's bloody footprints in the kitchen supported the idea that Rob moved Lee's body around after Lee was killed. Rob Fisher was found guilty of second-degree murder. His attorney filed a motion to set aside the verdict. The judge granted the motion. She said that the verdict was contrary to the weight of the evidence. She was particularly unimpressed by one of the state's 2 blood spatter experts, suggesting that he was inconsistent and not credible. Rob was released in March of 2014. Later, the Arizona Court of Appeals reinstated his conviction, but the Arizona Supreme Court threw out the decision and ordered a new trial. Rob was indicted in 2018. It looked like he was going to have to face a second trial, but in the fall of 2021, the case was dismissed without prejudice, which means that Rob could be charged again in the future. The sword of Damocles is hanging over his head. The court said that the dismissal was in the interest of justice. Now moving to my analysis. Was Rob Fisher guilty of murder? Many people, including the state of Arizona, believe that he was, but others say that Rob's personality is inconsistent with murder. Let's take a look at the evidence both for and against the idea that Rob was guilty, starting with the inculpatory evidence. The weapon that killed Lee Radder belonged to Rob Fisher. Rob introduced the gun into the house. Lee did not own a gun and was unfamiliar with how they operated. Rob said that he disassembled the pistol when he arrived at Belinda's house in order to hide the weapon from the children. This makes absolutely no sense. Again, the gun was a Sig Sauer P230. It's already pretty small. Even if he had a larger gun, disassembling it would not impart some type of massive benefit as far as hiding it. It wasn't like he was trying to hide a missile launcher or a flamethrower. Why not simply remove the magazine and the round from the chamber? Why didn't Rob lock his gun in his vehicle if he was that worried about it? If the gun was disassembled, how did Lee discharge it? It was clearly assembled when it fired. Did he reassemble the weapon in a state of intoxication? Gunshot residue was found on Rob Fisher's shirt. There was blood spatter on Rob's pajamas. It's clear that Rob was in the kitchen when the gun discharged. At his trial, his defense attorney conceded that Rob was sitting next to Lee when the shooting occurred. This means that Rob was being deceptive when he told the police the story about being in the bedroom and hearing a popping sound. There was no gunshot residue found anywhere on Lee. There should have been if he fired the gun. Lee's partial thumbprint, which was found on the trigger, was a blood print. This makes it seem as though he was shot, then his thumb pressed against the trigger. Rob Fisher left 3 bloody footprints around Lee's body, which could be interpreted as an attempt to manipulate the body, like Rob was moving around Lee's body trying to position it in a way to make it look like Lee could have fired the gun. It could also be used to show that Rob really wasn't that intoxicated. He was able to maneuver around Lee's body without any problems. The nature of the shooting was bizarre if Lee was the one who pulled the trigger. Lee Radder sustained a gunshot wound to his eye. This is a very unusual location for a self-inflicted gunshot wound, occurring less than only 0.5% of cases. Using one's thumb to pull the trigger in these situations is highly out of the ordinary. It's almost unheard of. If Lee retrieved the gun from Rob's duffel bag, which was in a different room, why did Lee walk back into the kitchen and sit down before discharging the weapon? The police asked Rob Fisher, "What do you feel happened?" Rob replied twice with the same answer, "I don't believe I shot him." Moving to the exculpatory evidence, Rob Fisher had absolutely no motive to kill Lee Radder. Neither Rob Fisher's fingerprints nor his DNA were found on the gun. Lee was tens of thousands of dollars in debt. Lee repeatedly lied about a potentially lucrative business deal, like he was trying to impress people. Maybe he could not tolerate being perceived as a failure. Lee had told Belinda on several occasions that he was worth more to her dead than alive. Rob Fisher's blood alcohol content was 3 times the legal limit for driving. Perhaps he was in a blackout at the time of the shooting. This is why he didn't remember who Lee was. Blood spatter analysis is notoriously unreliable. Rob Fisher argued that Lee Radder saw him disassembling the gun. That's how Lee knew where the gun was located. When considering all this evidence, do I think that Rob Fisher was guilty? Yes, I think he was guilty of murder in reality, but I do not think he was guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. The most compelling evidence of guilt is the fact that Rob lied and his gun was involved. At the very least, it seems like he was negligent. Here's how I think about this case. The police were convinced that Belinda was not involved, and of course the children were not involved. No one entered the house that morning. This only leaves 2 possibilities as far as people who could have pulled the trigger: Rob Fisher or Lee Radder. They could have pulled the trigger in one of 2 ways, intentionally or unintentionally. This leaves us with 4 theories, all of which are based on this idea that Rob and Lee were intoxicated. Theory number 1 is that the men had some type of dispute and Rob killed Lee intentionally. Theory number 2 is that Rob retrieved his weapon from the duffel bag and brought it into the kitchen to show Lee. Like Rob thought the gun was cool, he believed that Lee might want to see it. When Rob was showing it to Lee, Rob unintentionally pulled the trigger. So theory number 1 would be intentional murder. Theory number 2 would be negligence. With theory number 3, Rob retrieved the gun and showed it to Lee, except in this theory, Lee intentionally pulled the trigger. For whatever reason, Lee decided that he wanted to make his exit at that moment, perhaps due to his string of financial failures. I don't believe that Lee retrieved the gun himself, but this is also a possibility. It's a version of theory number 3. Theory number 4 is that Lee unintentionally pulled the trigger. Perhaps he was looking down the barrel of the weapon with his thumb on the trigger. This is how he was shot in the eye. Regardless of which theory is correct, Rob realized that the situation was bad news for him, especially considering his gun was involved. He decided his best defense was pretending that the alcohol compromised his memory. He didn't know what the physical evidence would reveal, so he left the possibility of shooting Lee open by saying, "I don't believe I shot him." When looking at all these theories, I would rank theory number 1, intentional murder, as the most probable. Then I would go with theory number 3, Lee intentionally pulled the trigger. Most of the time when a gun is discharged, it is intentional. After this, I would go with theory number 4, Lee unintentionally pulled the trigger, and then theory number 2, Rob unintentionally discharged the weapon. Regardless of which theory is true, Rob Fisher introduced the gun into the equation and was responsible for keeping it safe. In addition, he became intoxicated and was deceptive. If Rob was truly innocent, he put himself in a situation where it is easy to believe that he was guilty. This case is a reminder that it's negligent to introduce a firearm into any situation that involves alcohol consumption. Many people look at life and think it's just not dangerous enough. They correctly reason that adding alcohol will remedy that problem. Those are my thoughts on the case of Lee Radder. Please put any opinions and thoughts in the comments section. They always generate an interesting dialogue. As always, I hope you found my analysis of this topic to be informative. Thanks for watching.